What's up, everybody? In this video, we're going to be comparing two books. The first one is going to be Extreme Ownership, which I lost the cover for this one a long time ago. So the big red book. And the second one is going to be the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. So in this video, I'll give a little bit of context around both of these books just to lay a foundation. Then we're going to dive into the first habit of the 7 habits of highly effective people. And then we're going to bring that back to how it compares to some of the ideas that we learn in the book Extreme Ownership. And we're going to find some really cool similarities, not only between the ideas of the two books, but how they're structured and the principles that lay the foundation for both. So to lay the context for these books, the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, was published in 1989. It's written by Stephen Covey, this is actually the first book I've read by Stephen Covey. But whenever I talk to older mentors of mine who have focused on leadership and read leadership books, Stephen Covey is an author that they often cite. So this is one that I've known for a while I needed to dive into to get a better understanding of. And this is the first time I'm really diving into it. And Extreme Ownership, published in 2015 by Jocko, Willink. This one's been very foundational for me for essentially ever since I entered the professional world. And last thing on the context for these is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It says it on the top here. It's got over 40 million copies sold, whereas Extreme Ownership, based on my research, looks like it sold over 1 million. I would have thought it was more than that. Maybe it's just because I'm so deep entrenched in the world. Heck, I've gifted probably at least 100 of those copies. But the reason that's important is just understanding, hey, there's probably a lot more people that have read this book, especially with older mentors, than have read this book. So really great to understand principles between two different books, two different authors, what words they use to communicate the same principles, and just setting that foundational understanding. So with that, we're going to dive in to the first habit of the 7 habits of highly effective people, which is being proactive. To explain this idea of being proactive, Covey lays out a story that I think does a great job conveying the point that he's getting at. And this story is about an organization that has a very dictatorial style president who treats all his executives like gophers, which means go do this, go do that. And this group of executives is having challenges working with the president of this company, and all of them except for one guy who steps up and is proactive with this situation. So diving into the story, into the book, one of these executives was proactive. He was driven by values, not feelings. He took the initiative, he anticipated, he empathized, he read the situation. He was not blind to the president's weaknesses, but instead of criticizing them, he would compensate for them. Where the president was weak in his style, he tried to buffer his own people and make such weaknesses irrelevant. And he'd work with the president's strengths, his vision, talent, and creativity. This man focused on his circle of influence. He was treated like a gopher also, but he would do more than what was expected. He anticipated the president's needs. He read with empathy the president's underlying concern, so when he presented information, he also gave his analysis and his recommendations based on that analysis. So here we see one of the executives, this guy is stepping up, being proactive, and really focusing on leading up the chain of command and working on what he does have influence on, which is how he's acting, instead of being concerned and focusing on how his boss could, would, or should need to adjust to what he's doing. So skipping a little bit forward in the book, diving back in, it's the nature of reactive people to absolve themselves of responsibility. It's so much safer to say, I am not responsible. If I say I am responsible, I might have to say I am irresponsible. It would be very hard for me to say that I have the power to choose my response, and that the response I have chosen has resulted in my involvement in a negative, collusive environment, especially if for years I have absolved myself of responsibility for results in the name of someone else's weaknesses. So these executives focused on finding more information, more ammunition, more evidence as to why they weren't responsible. So here we've got all the other executives that are figuring out other ways, or essentially complaining about the president and figuring out all these ways that they are not responsible for what's going on and how it's not their fault. diving back into the book, but this man was proactive toward them too, and them meaning the other executives. Little by little, his circle of influence toward them grew also. It continued to expand to the extent that eventually no one made any significant moves in the organization without this man's involvement and approval, including the president. So, if you're familiar with the book Extreme Ownership, this story is going to sound very similar. This idea of being proactive and focusing on your circle of influence is the exact same idea as extreme ownership, right? This executive in this story took extreme ownership. He realized that what he could do was own the way that he operated toward the president, and that was going to be most effective for him in moving the company towards where they wanted to go. So this idea of being proactive and extreme ownership, I believe, are just hitting at the same core principle of the idea that we need to focus on those things that we do have influence on. And lastly, and this is probably the thing that I think is the coolest between these two books, is actually the structure of how the authors present this idea. So in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, this is habit number 1. And Covey does say that the habits are in order of importance. And so this is habit number 1. And on top of that, the first 3 habits of the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People fall into a section that Covey titles Private Victory, which is essentially talking about how you need to focus on winning the battle within before you start really being focusing on how you're interacting with other people. You've got to get yourself straight first. He calls it an inside-out approach. And in Extreme Ownership, the chapter Extreme Ownership is also the first chapter in the book called Extreme Ownership. So obviously a very core foundational idea. But on top of that, the first section of the book of Extreme Ownership is titled Winning the War Within. So you've got the first section in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People titled Private Victory, with the first habit being proactive, and then the first section in Extreme Ownership called Winning the War Within, and the first chapter of that being Extreme Ownership. So I think between these two, we get a very clear understanding that the most foundational principle for us in our lives is this idea of being proactive, in Covey's words, or taking extreme ownership in Jocko's words, focusing on those things that we have influence on, owning that, and then owning the results that come from it. So really cool to see how both those authors had that as the core first principle. And so for this video, I'll end it at that. And then next week, we'll continue with some of the comparisons between these two books. See you then.